Hello and welcome, my friends. Welcome to Magpie Reads. I'm Lindy and I have got 10 books that I've finished this week to tell you about and one bail. First, the weather. More snow. One of the good things about having a new puppy is her enthusiasm for snow. I'll include a little clip so you can see just how darn cute she is and thrilled by the snow, whereas by this time of the year I'm feeling pretty jaded. Anyway, my other news is that I saw a neuro-ophthalmologist earlier this week, and good news from him. My vision problems are improving, and he expects that within the next 6 to 8 months they should clear up entirely, and in the meantime I'm to keep doing the vision exercises, therapy, so that's good. And last week I talked about Stone Fruit, the graphic novel by Lee Lai, and said I was surprised that it hadn't had more notice. And I think it was Scott of Gunpowder Fiction and Plot who pointed out that it is a finalist for the Stella Prize in Australia. And then just in the past day, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize finalists have been announced, and it's on the list for graphic novels. Actually, out of those 5 graphic novels, 2 are by Canadian creators, and then Lee Lai lives in Canada, so out of 5, we could say 3 Canadians, which I think is excellent. And for sure 3 of them are queer. I don't know about the other 2, but it's a very interesting graphic novel list. I will include a link in the show notes if you're interested. As far as stats go, in addition to the bail that I mentioned, I read 3 audiobooks, 5 graphic novels, and 2 books of poetry. Well, 1 poetry collection and 1 biography that's written partly in verse and partly in prose. So, the Bail. That was a book that I picked up because it is on the Women's Prize for Fiction list. It's called Creatures of Passage, and it's by Morowa Yejide. And I'd been reading it for 2 weeks, and I was still only 15% in. Had it in ebook format, and I just kept not feeling like picking it up. Just not for me at this time. I'm saving the best for last, but there's lots of great stuff out of these books I'm going to be telling you about. I'm going to start with Welcome to the New World. So this is a graphic journalism. It is by Jake Halpern and Michael Sloan. Sloan did the illustrations. And it is about a Bedouin family from Syria who left Homs because of the war, and they were refugees in Jordan for a number of years until they got permission to travel to the United States, and they arrived in the US the very same day that Donald Trump was elected. The story focuses on one of the 5 children in the main family, because there's actually 2 families. 2 brothers came at the same time, and they're both settled in Connecticut, but about 45 minutes drive apart from each other. So this one family of the Aldebans has 5 children, and Naji, the eldest, is the focus. And I was more interested in the parents. So there were things in the first 2 chapters, cat is trying to, sorry about that. In the first 2 chapters, that was causing a problem for me of enjoying the book. But by chapter 3, I was all in. This family received a death threat, and so how that was handled by the police and the FBI, and the bits of humor that are in it really were a nice counterpoint to the more serious hardships of this family. Like, for example, Nadia, on his first day in the U.S., looks out the back door and he sees a squirrel and he thinks, whoa, what kind of mouse is that? Yeah, that sort of thing. The art has a very fluid style. Yeah, so not just black and white, it's got one additional color, so the blue spot color. And when the children go to school, they're at a so when the children start school, they are in English language learning, and their teacher there asks all of the students to draw their dream house, and then they're going to present it in English. And this is what Nadia draws. And he says, it has lots of animals and lots of safety. I like to feel safe. This is a very moving story, and I do highly recommend it. I've got another immigrant story, Home, and the author of this one is Julio, Anta, and there are some other creators as well. I'll talk about the illustrator in a moment. So this one is about Guatemalan refugees, and the opening scenes show a mother and her young son traveling from Guatemala. She has good reason to fear that her son will be killed by the same people who killed her husband. And so through all of the scenes of them making their way from Guatemala to the U.S. border, there are text boxes with the immigration policy change that's happening regarding asylum seekers, and particularly saying that immigrants arriving with children will have their children removed from them. So that's the scenario, very much reflects real life. In this case, the family is traveling to meet up with a sister-in-law who lives in Texas, but they don't get that far when they are put into detention and separated. And that's when we find out that the boy has superpowers. So it really adds an exciting element, but at the same time bringing up important human rights issues. So the illustrator is Polish, Anna Wieszczyk, and oh, look at that. I love those end papers. And normally, I'm not really a fan of digital art, but I think she has done a wonderful job with facial expression. And because this is a human interest story, I think that is really, really important. There are lots of reflection questions and sort of educator stuff at the back of this book for schools who are using it. And next up is one that I read in ebook format, and it's the conclusion to the Descender series by Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen. So that volume is called Machine War, War between Robots and Humankind. And I liked it, but I expected more. It was Reed Becca's favorite, one of her favorites of 2021. And I have really been enjoying the series as well. But I felt like the ending was somehow maybe too simplistic or naive. I'm not sure what. And as it turns out, it continues in a new series called Ascender. So maybe I need to read that whole series before I kind of get the whole picture. I'm certainly going to continue. So that's what's up with Descender. And another graphic novel is Squire. This one's by Sara Alfageeh and Nadia Shammas, who are both Arab Americans. Nadia is Palestinian American and Sara is Jordan American. And the setting is like maybe alternate history Jordan. So it is a fantasy, but with a lot of realistic elements to it. And the time period is about the Ottoman Empire, I would say. So our main protagonist, Isa, is from a minority group that has been colonized by this empire, and her dream is to become a knight. So she joins the military, and the questions about nationalism and imperialism, xenophobia, and about the whole violence of war are raised really well in here as part of an adventure story. So really cool. And the illustrations are nice and bright, and the landscape is based on Jordan, and it comes through really strongly as well. Here they are. So 2 new recruits traveling, and they're sharing stories about knights from history. They're both really excited about the romance of wielding a sword and becoming a knight. Hopes are dashed. And the final graphic novel is Nori. The author is Rumi Hara, who grew up in Japan. She lives in New York now, or I think. And this is based on her own experiences, her own childhood in the 80s when she was cared for by her grandmothers. So this is like slice of life, a little girl who's 3 and then 4 years old, and the time that she spent with her grandmother caring for her while her mother was at work. That's very sweet, but there are subtle social issues as well. They win a trip to Hawaii, and so the World War II is still fairly fresh in her grandmother's memory. And so this Nori is always running off. This is a big deal. not only is her grandmother elderly and not sure if she's ready to travel that far, but Nori she's a little escape artist. Here she is about to run off with the dog that has gotten loose. And look at her little leather jacket. Love it. Love it. Her grandmother is admiring the flowers. Highly enjoyable. I do recommend Nori. And next, so I listened to the audiobook of Hazel Bly and the Deep Blue Sea. It is by Ashley Herring Blake, and I picked it up because it is a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in the children's category. It's a middle grade chapter book. The audio is read by Natalie Duke, and I was disappointed. So the main protagonist is a 12-year-old curmudgeon with major anxiety issues. I like that part of it. The melodrama was just too much for me, and the writing style kind of irritated me. So it is in Hazel's voice, the 12-year-old, and she keeps saying, "Wait, what?" Because of course she does. Things like, "My heart was pounding like my ribs were going to crack open. My heart was fluttering like a baby bird about to take its first flight. My heart was fluttering like the wings of 1,000 birds. My mind swirls with 1,000,000 thoughts I can't figure out. My nerves were crashing like a tsunami inside me." You know, all of this kind of writing, and it just kept coming like a tsunami. It's not my kind of thing. And the other thing is, there are 2 romance subplots. So Hazel's had 2 mothers. One of them died. This is part of the trauma that Hazel is dealing with. And her mom, who's still alive, is a lesbian romance author. And through the course of the novel, she falls in love with somebody. And also, Hazel has her first kind of romance with someone her age through the course of the novel. And romance plots just don't appeal to me. And there wasn't enough other stuff that did, plus the irritating writing style. And there were so many coincidences that were crucial to the plot. I think 1 or 2 coincidences, fine, but after that, no. And I didn't like the way that magic realism was used in this book. Nothing against magic realism, actually, usually I like it. I didn't like the way it was used in this book, so it did not work for me. 3 stars, so I can see that other readers who don't have my peculiar tastes could enjoy it, but you know, out of the 2 middle grade novels that are on that Lambda literary list, I definitely preferred The Fabulous Zed Watson, and that's by Basil Sylvester and Kevin Sylvester. So, just saying. If you've read Hazel Bly and the Deep Blue Sea, I'd like to hear what you think about it, so please let me know in the comments. Next up is another middle grade book, but this one's nonfiction. It's a biography of Octavia Estelle Butler, and it's called Star Child. The author is Ibi Zoboi. Normally, I really like verse narratives, and there's a lot of great things in this particular book. The strong points are that there's a lot of historical context that's included as part of this biography. The space race, the Cold War, the Great Migration of African Americans from the South going north and west. There's the Civil Rights Movement, science fiction pulp novels. So all of these things that affected Octavia Butler and her writing. There are some great photographs in here and historic documents, including an early story that Octavia Butler wrote when she was 10 years old, and there's a page of her writing plus an illustration that she did. It's a story about horses. There are lots of quotes from Octavia Butler as well, and they are all really good quotes. So what I didn't like is that sometimes in the prose, what Zoboi did was she just sort of elaborated on something that was from a Butler quote on the same page, and it was just too much the same. And in the sections that are in verse, some of the poems are good, some just okay. And yeah, with verse, it really needs to be strong. And I didn't think that these all worked. Some of them were good. There are some concrete poems. Star Child, Moon Child. The whole design of this book is very nice. And I think that it would be great for inspiring girls, that they can grow up and be an author. And I love a photo at the end where the author and Octavia Butler are shown together because they share a birthday and they were at a workshop together. And so that was 2001. Butler was 6 feet tall by the time she was in middle school. A very tall woman. Anyway, I would still recommend this, but with some reservations, as I said. Maybe part of the problem with Star Child was that I started reading Junebat by John Elizabeth Stintzi, and the poems in here are exquisite. The language is just so alive, vivid. It was bringing out emotion. The author is trans, non-binary, a Canadian. During the course of the poems in here, they recount a year living in isolation and or exile, really, in New Jersey, and coming to terms with their gender identity and learning to accept living in a particular body. So, yeah, if you are at all interested in gender identity, I highly recommend this. The same year that this came out, Stintzi also had a novel published. It's called Vanishing Moments. And when I read that, I felt like my brain was being reshaped to be from the viewpoint of someone who's non-binary. I recommend that one as well. So, Junebat. And then my last two books are both audiobooks. I loved them both so much. The novel Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki, who is a trans author. This audiobook is read by Cindy Kay. And the central character in this novel, or one of the main characters, is also trans, Katrina. She is abused at home in California. She's of mixed ethnicity, Vietnamese, Chinese, and Latina, I think, Mexican. And she's a violin player. And she meets up with a woman who's a violin teacher who's made a deal with the devil, has to deliver some souls. And they meet up with a woman and her family who are refugees from an intergalactic war, and they're running a donut shop. There is so much going on, and it's so much fun. I've found it very heartwarming in its message, and I just didn't want to stop listening to it. So I would find it, I would say, very successful. 5 stars. And my final book, 5 great big stars, goes to a work of nonfiction called Humankind, A Hopeful History. It's by a Dutch author, Rutger Bregman, and translated by Erica Moore and Elizabeth Manton. The audiobook has an introduction read by the author, and then the main part of it is read by Thomas Judd. So it is a hopeful history. There are rules to live by that this author suggests. When in doubt, assume the best. Temper your empathy and train your compassion. Avoid the news. And all of these rules, there are reasons. So, for example, avoid the news because it skews your view of the world. The news tends to generalize people into broad categories like politicians, refugees, and even worse, the news emphasizes bad apples, and social media does the same. So what Rutger is suggesting is that just consume enough journalism to understand what's going on in the world, but remember that news is to the mind what sugar is to the body. I actually don't know where that quote comes from, but there are so many sociological experiments that I'm familiar with, say from reading Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point, that I hadn't realized were skewing my view. So, for example, the experiment with the students being divided into prisoners and prison guards, and that was entirely different than how it was characterized when that study came out. There were sociologists who tried to replicate that Lord of the Flies kind of situation, And it turns out that boys tend to want to help each other as opposed to be in competition with each other, and that it's really hard to get them to fight and be on opposite sides. There's something like 80% of soldiers in these wars that they're citing never fire their guns, or else they fire them in the air because they don't want to hurt other people. There's all kinds of studies that show that people are basically good. There are very few that aren't. And so our lives will be much better if we're realistic. And by realistic, we're not talking about being cynical. Being realistic is accepting that humankind is good. One of the ideas that was new to me is the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. Then there's lots about how important it is to encourage children to play, and adults. I feel like I just can't do this book justice, except to say, if you want to read something to make you feel better about living in this world, read Humankind. And that's the last word on that. Thanks so much for listening. I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.